Today I'm in central London for a special episode following the death of Queen Elizabeth II. As monarch, she had many residences across the UK and spent a lot of time travelling around the world, but she was a Londoner. So in this episode we're going to look at a handful of locations in the capital that played key roles in her life. And we start at the very beginning. At 20 to 3 on the morning of the 21st of April 1926, Princess Elizabeth was born here at what was then 17 Bruton Street in Mayfair. It was the home of her grandfather on her mother's side, Claude Bowes-Lyon, the Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn. Elizabeth's parents were Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon and Prince Albert, the Duke of York, who would go on to become King George VI. Lilibet, as she was nicknamed, was third in line to the throne behind her uncle Edward and her father, but she was never expected to become queen. At the time, 17 Bruton Street was a townhouse rather than a lavish palace which many members of the royal family live in these days. This shows the state of the monarchy's finances at the time, although the house was still in the affluent area of Mayfair. Bruton Street also connects to Berkeley Square, where Elizabeth's parents would have taken her as a baby. The house in which she was born was demolished in 1937, when people were apparently less sentimental about historical buildings, but the future queen and her parents moved out long before then. In fact, around a year after she was born, they moved here, to what was then 145 Piccadilly, but is now 1 Hamilton Place. The family would split their time between the townhouse on this site and the Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park. Piccadilly was and still is one of the most desirable addresses in London, and Princess Elizabeth's home was sandwiched in between Green Park and Hyde Park, before it was destroyed by the Luftwaffe in the Second World War. It was also a stone's throw from Buckingham Palace, where she would later move in 1936, when her grandfather, King George V, died, and her uncle, King Edward VIII, triggered a constitutional crisis by abdicating so he could marry an American divorcee, Wallis Simpson. Elizabeth's father, Albert Frederick Arthur George, or Bertie, became King George VI, making the princess the heir to the throne. In 1939, the Second World War broke out, and being a famous landmark in the middle of London, Buckingham Palace was a prime target for German air raids. It was bombed 9 times, including while the King and Queen were there. Afterwards, the Queen said, "I'm glad we've been bombed, now I can look the East End in the face." Much of London's poor and industrial East End was destroyed by the Luftwaffe, and this made the royal family look as though they were just like everyone else. In one particularly famous incident during the Battle of Britain, an RAF pilot named Ray Holmes came across a German bomber that was heading towards the palace. He was out of ammunition, so instead rammed the plane with his own before bailing out. He survived and lived to the age of 90, although some historians have questioned the accuracy of the story, believing that the ramming could have been an accident. During the war, there were calls for Princess Elizabeth and her sister, Princess Margaret, to be evacuated to Canada, but their mother, Queen Elizabeth, who later became known as the Queen Mother, declared, "The children won't go without me. I won't leave without the king, and the king will never leave." While the young princesses didn't flee the country, they did temporarily move out of Buckingham Palace, and throughout the war they lived at Balmoral Castle, Sandringham House in Norfolk, the Royal Lodge and Windsor Castle, although Princess Elizabeth would be destined to return to Buckingham Palace. In 1940, she visited BBC Broadcasting House, where she made her first radio broadcast on Children's Hour. She addressed other children who'd been evacuated from cities. After the war, Princess Elizabeth appeared alongside her sister and parents on the balcony of Buckingham Palace. Behind them were blacked-out windows, but in front of them were crowds of people celebrating. Elizabeth even went out into the street, disguised, and mingled with ordinary people, later saying, "We asked my parents if we could go out and see for ourselves. I remember we were terrified of being recognised. I remember lines of unknown people linking arms and walking down Whitehall. All of us just swept along on a tide of happiness and relief." In 1946, Princess Elizabeth became engaged to her second cousin once removed, Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark. They'd spent years writing letters to each other, and the engagement was a secret at first. The king had given Philip his blessing, provided that the official engagement was delayed until a year later, when Elizabeth was 21. After the couple were married in 1947, they moved to Clarence House, just along the Mall from Buckingham Palace. It was here that Princess Elizabeth would give birth to her second child and only daughter, Anne, now known as the Princess Royal. In 1952, King George VI died, and Princess Elizabeth, who was famously in Kenya at the time, became Queen. In 1953, she moved from Clarence House back to Buckingham Palace as she took up her new role as monarch. She had her coronation at Westminster Abbey on the 2nd of June 1953, where she'd married Prince Philip nearly 6 years earlier. Since the coronation of William the Conqueror, all coronations of English and British monarchs have taken place here. Queen Elizabeth's coronation was a huge event in the UK and was broadcast live in full and in colour. Many people in the UK didn't have televisions at this time and so bought or rented them so they could watch. And of course, on the 8th of September 2022, after 70 years on the throne, Queen Elizabeth died at the age of 96, and her state funeral was held here at Westminster Abbey. The service was attended by around 2,000 people from across the world, and it's estimated a further 4 billion people watched it on TV. Now, I want to end by saying that I know that many people will have mixed feelings about Queen Elizabeth and the monarchy in general, and most of them are completely valid. I myself have my own opinions which I won't share here. And as for the Queen's legacy, well, that's something that I will leave to be determined by much more qualified people. But the death of someone who'd been the symbolic figurehead of your country for your whole life, your parents' lives, and maybe even your grandparents' lives, is pretty significant. There have been many people who've been devastated by the news of the Queen's death. Others have been pretty indifferent. But it's difficult to deny that it just felt weird.
I don't know if it's just because they're all together. I don't know. Yeah, it feels different.